So in this next recording, we're going to talk about lakes and wetlands. And how we're going to differentiate the two is that there are several definitions out there, but the one I like is that at their deepest point, no rooted vegetation can grow in lakes, whereas in wetlands or ponds and things like that, they're shallow enough where rooted vegetation can grow throughout the water body. So lakes can form in a variety of ways. Glacially, as we see throughout Canada, is probably the most common way on Earth lakes form, especially in like recently eroded field rock, whether it be in Canada or Scandinavia. Tectonics, we see like in the Great African Rift Valley with the African Great Lakes, or Lake Baikal in Russia. Calderas, as we see many different parts of the world. Like I believe Mount Hood in Oregon has a caldera in it. Oxbow lakes, we talked about briefly in fluvial geomorphology, where if one of those meanders gets big enough, then it can form a lake and get cut off from the rest of the river. And you can have natural dams as well, which could also be like glacial things like moraines, so on and so forth. So we'll talk briefly about lake ecology, and lakes are generally classified into oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic, depending on how much life they can support sort of per unit volume. And this is often measured in the form of net primary productivity, so the amount of energy stored in living things. So eutrophic lakes can support a lot of life. Oligotrophic are not so much. They tend to be clear, but also kind of dead and lifeless. Now, the limiting factor for most lakes in terms of how much life they can support is often the presence of nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. And this is why when you have drainage of these nutrients off of, say, agricultural settings from chemical fertilizers, you can get this process known as eutrophication, where these excess nutrients that farmers are putting on their fields, but instead are being washed off and into our lakes, promote the growth of aquatic life like algae, and cause these nasty, harmful algal blooms in lakes like Lake Erie. So in terms of, we'll move now from lakes to wetlands, and Ramsar defines wetlands as having a water depth at low tide, because some are coastal, of under 6 meters. So again, fairly shallow, supports vegetation throughout. So we'll talk about both coastal and terrestrial wetlands. So in terms of coastal wetlands, if you're in a coastal environment that can support a wetland, if you're between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, you'll tend to get mangroves. And if you're above that in either hemisphere, then you'll get salt marshes. In terms of terrestrial wetlands, there are many different types. There are swamps, which are treed wetlands, marshes, which are grassy wetlands. You can have peatland, including bogs and fens. Bogs are nutrient poor quagmires, and they're nutrient poor because they tend to get most of their water from rainfall rather than groundwater or stream flow. Fens are more nutrient rich than bogs because they have a stream flow or groundwater component. There are also ephemeral wetlands, which are only wet seasonally. Wetlands have many benefits and give us many reasons to conserve them, including being a carbon sink, so they're important for our fight against climate change. They offer flood protection, as we discussed from that hydrograph from earlier. They sort of smooth out the hydrograph so the peak is later and less intense. They provide important habitat for a variety of organisms. In coastal settings, they're fantastic for shoreline stabilization and protect against tropical storms. And of course, they have many recreational uses as well. So here are some examples of wetlands. You can sort of try and identify what type it is as I go through them. This one is a marsh, and this is actually at Point Pelee National Park. It's a beautiful park if you have the chance to visit. This one, it's a type of wetland you find between roughly 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. And this is our mangrove. Now, this one's a bit difficult. It is not a mangrove, but it is a treed wetland in a temperate setting. This is going to be our swamp. This is a swamp near Barrie in Ontario. This is it's a grassy wetland, but it's in a marine coastal setting, and it's not a mangrove, so it's our salt marsh at Grand Pre UNESCO site, which I had the pleasure of visiting in April. And lastly, this is, a more typical wetland landscape in Canada's north, and we see a lot of different things going on. So we have our river through, so you might see maybe some fens around the river, or some of these areas might be bogs. It's hard to tell exactly, but this is a very this is a wetland landscape in the Hudson Bay lowlands of Ontario. So that is it for lakes and wetlands, and then the next recording we will start talking about oceanography.